So the links everybody for doing the poll. I appreciate that. That does really help. We did that same poll 2 days ago, so we have a whole week here of Power BI. In fact, we'll have another session tomorrow as well on Power BI. Tomorrow's going to be on Power Query that Brian's going to be doing. So I appreciate you doing that poll. That does help. Like I said, one we did is we did the exact same poll on Tuesday, and we were about a little bit less. We were about 14% had Office 365. So we got a little bit different audience today. Now, the reason we asked about Office 365 is because a lot of the tools that we're showing you this week, again, this whole week is all Power BI presentations. The reason we're asking that is because a lot of the new Power BI features require that you have Office 365. And if you hung in here with me on Tuesday, you might have heard me mention that a lot of new functionalities coming out with Power BI in Office 365, including Q&A, which is the feature I talked about on Tuesday, as well as the Power BI sites. Now, another feature that a lot of people were a little surprised by, but that's only available in Office 365, is Power Map. Now, Power Map was officially released about 3.5 weeks ago, and with the official release, the most up-to-date version that you can download with the official release is Office 365 only. Now, you can certainly go and still download the preview that they had previous to that, which does work on more traditional Excel. You don't have to have Office 365 to use the preview, but to get the official released copy of Power Map, it is an integrated part of Office 365. So just so you're aware of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get going here. All right, so just to introduce myself very briefly here, my name is Devin Knight. I'm the training director here at Pragmatic Works. So I run any kind of training, and I work very heavily with Rachel on doing the webinars. I'm also a SQL Server MVP, and I've authored 6 SQL Server books. I also run a user group here in Jacksonville, Florida, where we focus on all topics SQL Server, including BI, SQL Server, big data, any kind of data topics, really. I also blog at a website called BIDN.com. That's the Business Intelligence Development Network. And usually I like to blog about technical topics, but occasionally I'll put kitty cat pictures out there. All right. So our plan for today, what I'm going to show you and talk about, is a little bit of an overview for Power Map. So we'll discuss and look at what Power Map's all about, why you would use it. We'll then get into actually linking geographical fields to a Power Map solution. And we'll also talk about bringing in time data, or time elements, into a Power Map solution. So that way you can actually look at geographical data on a 3D map, but be able to look at it also across time. Then finally, we'll look into creating a Power Map tour, which is going to be taking all these different elements of a Power Map solution or a visualization and bringing it together into a single, basically like a video, where you can see a video of your data across a geographical surface. All right, so I think what really probably would help, and most of you probably already realize this, if you're looking at a data set, I have 2 data sets here on my screen right now, and it's probably pretty clear on which one displays and tells the most about the data. On the left-hand side, I have more of a tabular view of the data, where it just shows, don't ask about the data itself. I have looks like deaths here for some reason. And on the right-hand side, I have a map that's showing the exact same data set, but it's focused in a geographical view of a map. Actually, that's a view of a Power Map solution. Clearly, the view on the right shows this best. It is able to display that data best, especially if it's geographical data. In this case, I have latitude and longitude, where it would best be displayed through some kind of a mapping interface. So I think the case for a mapping tool is pretty clear. Being able to view geographical data on a map is much, much, much better than being able to view it in a tabular view of your data. Okay. Of course, there's always a case for viewing it in a tabular view of your data, but this certainly helps to have it on a map. All right, so that is kind of the introduction on why you need Power Map. Power Map's great at taking geographical data and placing it on a 3D globe like you see on my screenshot on the right-hand side. A couple of the kind of features that you get with Power Map are you get a 3D visualization tool. It's this 3D globe, like you see on the far right, that's built into, and really it's an add-in for Excel 2013. Now, to preface that, I mentioned that just as we got started that when Power Map was officially released about 3 or 4 weeks ago, it was released as an Office 365 only tool. Now, of course, if you're using traditional Excel, meaning the regular Excel, the on-premises version of Excel, just the regular Excel, you can still do Power Map, but it's going to be using the preview. So there was a preview for Power Map that came out last year. That's slowly becoming more dated and dated. You can still experiment with Power Map through that, but if you want to get the most up-to-date version of Power Map that I'll be showing today, you do need Office 365. Now, basically what we're doing here with Power Map is we're taking these geographical fields that we have in our data and plotting it on a map. And we're visually showing those geographical data points that we have. Now it does analyze on a 3D globe, and it uses Bing, so that tells you do need to have a connection to internet to be able to do anything inside PowerMap. So assuming you have an internet connection, it uses Bing Maps to be able to visualize and plot out the data that you have in a data set. And the ultimate goal is what you're going to do is you're going to create a visual tour, kind of like a tour, like you're touring a city. You're going to be touring a map of your data. So you're actually going to create what's called scenes, and you bring together these scenes into a tour. And the ultimate goal is to share that tour with others. And we'll talk about how you do that. All right, so let's talk about linking geographical fields. The nice thing about PowerMap is it's extremely granular with the type of geographical fields you can use. So of course you can use latitude, longitude, city, country, county, state, zip code, but when it gets really interesting is you can go down to a street level. So I can go down to the street, provide a street, or even provide an address, and I can point it to my house, for example, and be able to visualize the home values over the last 10 years, that sort of thing. So there's some really neat things that you can do with PowerMap and at a very granular level. So you can these show the different granularities of geographical fields that you can show. All right, now if you want to really take your map to the next level, you're going to bring in some time element to your data. So assuming you have geographical fields, your data on that geographical data set probably changes across time. If you can bring in that time element as well, it allows you to animate that map so you can see across time how things have changed. You can do several things once you bring in a time element. When you bring in time or time to your data into PowerMap, it's going to allow you to visualize that data differently. So you'll notice here under the time settings heading I have here that you can persist the data differently whenever you bring in time. What I mean by that is you can persist the data at an instant. What that basically means is whenever there's a data point that happens at a certain point in time, it's going to show that data point and then make it disappear right away. You could also do time accumulation. Time accumulation means it's going to grow and grow and grow that data point over time. So think of a bubble chart. The bubble is going to get larger and larger and larger over time as you have more and more sales, for example. The last one there, persist the last, is always going to show the very last value that you have. So as you're showing data across time, it's always going to show the very last value. So you may have inventory that changes across time, and you're trying to track what your inventory is, and you may have several days, maybe over the weekend, where your inventory doesn't change at all. Well, you can use this persist the last to always show what the last value was, as opposed to the instant, where if you don't have your inventory changing over the weekend, instant would just show a blank value or show no value. So it just depends on how you want to be able to visualize that data across time. You would use these different properties that we'll take a look at in a few moments. Now you also have some ease of use when it comes to filtering across time. So if you have a time element to your data and you want to be able to visualize that on a map, you can actually filter certain regions of the map to be based on a time filter that you select. So I've shown in a previous webinar for Pragmatic Works that you can go download and watch the recording, or you can watch the recording, I should say. I showed where you can actually visualize election data, presidential election data across time. I'm not going to show that example today because I've done it previously, and you can watch that online on Pragmatic Works free webinars from the past. But what you could have done in that example that I showed is I had presidential election data, and I had election data from the earliest point where they had presidential elections. Well, obviously, if I looked at an election map, there were no presidential votes that were generated on the West Coast because they weren't really states yet. So because of that, I could actually use some of these time filter settings and filter down the West Coast to eliminate the early years where there were no presidential election votes. So there's a lot of neat things you can do with that. I can also control things like the playback speed. So if I want to visualize data across time, I can control how fast that time element is visualized. And it's all done through a nice, easy UI that we'll show here in a few moments. All right, last thing here we'll mention, or last couple things we'll mention, is the tours. I mentioned tours earlier are really what you're using to bring together all of the visualizations through a time element, an actual metric that you want to show, and a geographical field are all brought together through a tour. Now, a tour is really just a collection of scenes. You're going to create different scenes, kind of like a movie director, where you'll focus in on certain areas of the map. So I may want to first focus in on the Northeast, then once I show all the data elements that have occurred in the Northeast during a certain time period, I can then move over to the West Coast or the Northwest. And then once I show all the data elements in the Northwest, I can then move over to the Southeast. And it brings all these different scenes, my Northwest scene, my Northeast scene, and my Southeast scene, all together into what's called a tour. Now when this tour is created, I have the ease of outputting this to really a couple ways. So your output when it comes to Power Map is a little limited, but they're actually pretty decent outputs. One output is I can take my Excel file I've developed and send it to others. Okay, so I can take my Excel file as long as they have all of the same things that I have, meaning they have Excel 2013 and the Power Map add-in, then they can also watch and edit my Power Map solution. The other option is that you can take a Power Map tour and output it to an MP4 file or a video file. And it actually takes the solution that you've created and puts it into a video. And then as a video, you can really share that however you want. You can put it on YouTube, you can put it on a SharePoint site and embed the video. There's a lot of flexibility you have. And they've actually added some new functionality into the video creation where you can actually put things like audio to the video. So if I want to read off a script and tell it tell it a little information about the data as my users are viewing it, I can actually add audio to it as well. That's a new feature that's been added with the latest release. That's all Office 365. All right, so this is actually, by the way, some quick demonstrations here, and it's kind of intentional because Power Map is supposed to be an easy tool to pick up. So our idea here is we may not fill an entire hour, but I'm going to show you really what Power Map can do, and the idea being that it should be easy to do. It shouldn't necessarily take a long time to do. So here's our goal. We're going to take some data that I have. You'll notice my little symbols there in the bottom right. I have a globe, meaning we're going to map some data. And I also have what look like credit cards. We're going to take some credit card complaint data. So I'm going to imagine that I work for the customer service department for, let's say, Visa, okay? And I want to be able to see where most of my credit card complaints are being generated from. And that way I can see across time not only where those credit card complaints are being generated from, but I'm going to add in some other data to this as well and see things like demographic data or population data. Where is the most populated areas of the country, and how does that relate to the number of credit card complaints that I'm getting? And I want to be able to visualize that all on a map. Okay? So a different little way of visualizing this, I wanted to make sure I showed you guys some kind of different visualization in Power Map. So we're going to go with more of a customer service example in this case. So we're going to link that geographical data that we have to Power Map. We're then going to map that data across time. I'm going to add in a time element. And then I'm going to create a Power Map tour, meaning I'm going to pull together multiple scenes together, and then we're going to finally output that as a tour. All right, so I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to open up an Excel instance I already have open. Okay, and let me kind of introduce you to the data a little bit. I just mentioned a moment ago that it's going to be credit card complaint data. So I'll be able to see inside this first data set that we're looking at right now, it's all kinds of data by date. So you can see there is a date element to it, by zip code, by company. Okay, these are some of the more relevant things that we'll take a look at. So these are our Bank of America credit cards, Citibank credit cards, regions. I said I work for Visa. I'm sure Visa's in here as well. You can see American Express. And really Capital One, and some of these are different vendors for MasterCard and Visa. So maybe we'll look at a specific company here that we want to focus in on and pretend that we are trying to visualize for. So I have this geographical data, right? So we see zip codes. We see that these are complaints by zip code. So what I probably want to be able to do is visualize the number of complaints that I have by zip code. That would be pretty interesting. But I really want to take this to the next level. I want to make this so that not only can I visualize complaints by zip code, but I also want to be able to see things like the population. So the second data set that you see here is, again, by zip code. That's what the geography ID here is in the far left. This geography ID here is going to show me the total population for, it looks like 2013. It's the end of the year 2013. And I can see what the population was by zip code, by area of the country here, basically. And that way I can see if it makes sense why I have more credit card complaints in a certain area, because I might just have more people living in a certain area. So I want to be able to make that justification here. Now I also have other things in here, other types of demographic data in this data set. This is just census data, by the way. You can curate it yourself. It's just going through the census website to be able to get it. And I can pull in here things like demographics. So you can see I have in here things like the age groupings, where I have all of my population that's less than 19, those that are 20 to 64, that's a pretty big age gap, and then 65 plus. So I can kind of look at the different demographics here and justify maybe based on their age why there's more complaints. So some interesting data in here. So let's kind of get to it. Let's see how we can actually visualize this data. And I'm going to start with my credit card complaint data. So I'm going to actually go over to Power Map, which, by the way, you'll find Power Map under the Insert menu. Okay, so underneath the Insert menu inside of Excel 2013, you'll find that you can see mine might look slightly different than yours because, again, I am running Office 365. But you'll find underneath the Insert menu that there is a Map button. If for some reason you have downloaded and installed Power Map, but you still don't see the tool to be able to visualize that geographical data, if you still don't see Power Map, then you may need to enable the feature. Okay, so sometimes it's not good enough that you download and install it. Sometimes Excel still expects you to go check a little box to make sure it's enabled. So let me show you that briefly, just in case you are going to attempt to follow along later from the recording. You can come over to the File menu, and under File, you're going to go down to Options. So File, then Options. Under File and Options, there is an add-in page here. And under this add-ins page, you'll select that. And then we're going to tell it that we want to manage a COM add-in. It feels like it should be an Excel add-in, but it's actually a COM add-in. So you'll select COM and hit Go. And once you hit Go, you'll see here this checkbox that has all of the add-ins that you've enabled for Excel. So if for some reason you have one that you've installed, but you don't see it available inside your tabs up top, then you may need to come in here and actually check it off to ensure that it's shown up. Now sometimes there's even quirkiness, but even though that you've checked it off, you still don't see it in the ribbon at the top. In that case, it may be easiest to actually come in and uncheck it, hit OK, go back and check it again. That's been my situation a couple times. I've had to make sure I fix it that way. But if you have it checked, you should see it in your ribbon if everything's working properly. All right, so we do see it in my ribbon. Everything's showing up properly here. So if I want to start by creating a Power Map reporting solution, I'll click the down arrow next to Power Map and tell it that I want to launch a Power Map. Now what this is going to do is it's going to show me a list of all of the Power Map tours that I've created previously. And you can see I have one in here that I've created previously. I'm holding on to here as a backup just in case something goes wrong. I have that in here available for us to open up and we can take a look at a completed solution. But I want to create a solution from scratch here. So I'm going to create a new tour just by hitting the New Tour button on the bottom. And this is going to give me an empty little design surface here, which, by the way, what looks great on your screen, it may not come through as well whenever we're using a GoToMeeting, live meeting kind of environment here. But if you're using a tablet device, or if you're using, by the way, I am using a tablet, so I can actually use my fingers to move around on the screen here. If you are using a device like that, you have a lot of flexibility to kind of interact with this map. You can zoom in, zoom out very easily. You can also change some things around. So if you don't like this view of a flat globe and you prefer to see it more of a flat map, you'll notice up in the very top left that I do have the option here to flip this from a globe to more of a flat map, and it takes that map and it converts it more into a flat map. So it's a nice little transition from globe to flat map, and it's done through the ribbon at the very top here. And you can always flip it back. If I don't like the flat map, I can make it back into a 3D globe just by clicking on the flat map button again. You also have some other abilities to change in here, or some other functionalities you can change in here, things like map labels. So if I want to add in labels to my map, I can check off the map labels button, which is right next to the flat map. And then it visualizes a label on any of the geographical areas that you have on your map. You'll even see it shows up inside the oceans as well. So you can have geographical data using latitude and longitude that brings in data from the oceans. So for example, there's some NOAA data from the hurricane data. So if I wanted to track hurricane data and I had latitude and longitude of the different data points of those hurricanes, I could bring that in and actually show them coming in from Africa into the Florida or southeast area and visualize that as well. There's actually some really neat Power Map examples that show that. Now the nice thing about the map labels, is as you zoom in or you go closer into different areas of the country or the world, the map labels get more and more emphasized. So as I drill more and more into where I live, for example, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, the more and more I drill in, the more the labels persist and the more information I see as far as details for the labels. So kind of neat that it provides that to you. I'm going to zoom back out here. All right, now the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to turn off the map labels for a moment because I want to show you something else with those here in a few minutes, but I'm going to leave those off for now. The first thing I want to do is be able to map out each of my complaints. Now you'll see on the far right here I have two tables. Let me minimize them, for example, so you can see just the table names. I have credit card complaints and demographics. Now these two tables have been brought in from Excel. They're Excel tables, and as soon as I go to tell it that I want to put these tables that we saw here just a moment ago, see these tables that are inside of Excel, as soon as I tell it that I want to put these tables in the Power Map, what happens behind the scenes is it actually pushes the contents of these tables into Power Pivot. And Power Pivot is leveraged for being able to process all of that data that you're trying to map. So keep that in mind. Even though it doesn't really show you that something's happening in Power Map, there's almost like an automatic step where as soon as you tell it you want to put this into Power Map, it also puts it into Power Pivot as well to be able to process that large amount of data. All right, I just want to make you aware of that. In fact, just to show you that, by the way, if I go over to my Power Pivot tab, you'll see, even though I've never told it to put these things into Power Pivot, that it does have these two tables have been added into Power Pivot. Okay? All right. Now, what I'd like to be able to show you guys is, again, from the mapping solution, from inside Power Map, I want to be able to geographically show and display each of my credit card complaints. So I'm going to go drill into my credit card complaints and find the zip code. And I'll check off zip code here. Now, zip code is a pretty granular geographical field. If I had something like city, you may want to add in multiple geographical fields, because here's the problem you may encounter. If I select city, think about how many Springfields there are, or how many Jacksonvilles there are even. There's probably a Jacksonville for every state in the country. So when you have situations like that where you have maybe a kind of generic geographical field, like either address or city, you may also add in multiple columns. You can actually check off another column and add that in as another geographical field when it makes sense. For me, zip code is pretty specific. I can't get much more granular than zip code. So I'm going to leave this as zip code, which you can see here in the bottom right. Okay, and then I'm going to hit next. Now, you could actually change, and just in case for some reason that Power Map did not interpret this zip code column as the proper field. So notice here, I never told it that this was a zip code. All I did was I checked off my zip code column, and it automatically identified it as a zip code. Now, that's partially done, but based on a little quick sampling of the data. So it does a quick little sampling of the data to make a guess on what kind of field it is. But it may make a mistake, and if it makes a mistake in guessing what kind of field it is, you can change it. You'll see over here on the far right, there's a nice little drop down here where you can actually tell it that even though you guessed that this was a zip code, it's really a county or something like that. So you have the flexibility here to change the geographical property. But keep in mind what you're seeing here is on the left-hand side is a column from inside of my data source. On the right-hand side is the property inside Power Map. Okay? Once you have these two fields mapped properly or connected properly, you'll simply hit the next button. And when you hit that next button, it just confirms your geographical field. And you can see on the very top right, up top here, that we have mapped our zip code with a 99% accuracy. And if you want to see exactly which ones that it did not map properly, you can click this little hyperlink here where it says 99%, and it will show you in a little mapping solution here where it was not able to geographically map some fields. So for example, some here I got these errors where it said no resolution for this address. So I have a bunch of them in here. It was not able to determine what the actual zip code was. This one where it's triple zeros would make sense. I'm not sure what kind of zip code that was, but it wasn't able to interpret it. So it gives me a little mapping report. But I was within a 99% accuracy of being able to map all of these zip codes. And if I really want to go see why it wasn't able to map some of them, then I can always come back in here and figure them out. Now the other thing that you're seeing here in this little mapping report is that it looked at some of these zip codes, like these for example, where it had a zip code and a latitude longitude, and it interpreted that as really being this. So it gave me a little warning right here, and it gave me a warning that it couldn't recognize this zip code that we typed in or that we provided. But what it interpreted that as was the first 5 characters here, and it interpreted that this first 5 characters as really being referenced to this zip code in Massachusetts. So it was able to take something that we provided that was a little inaccurate and make its best guess on what it was trying to do. And so you can actually come in here and see how it mapped those out. It looked like it did a pretty good job of doing that. Okay? And there's 53 pages of this report, so I can go through all 53 pages and kind of sift through what I don't think is correct. All right, so just keep in mind you have that available. Unfortunately, there's not a good output for this, so it would be nice if there was a little export to Excel button, but there's not, unfortunately. So you kind of have to sift through this report just by looking at it through this window we're looking at right now. All right, good deal. Now, so we've taken and we've mapped out all of our geographical fields. By the way, if you want to change how you're mapping or what granularity you're mapping at, you can always change the map by zip code here by hitting the little pencil icon to edit the geographical fields. So if I hit edit on that, it'll then bring me back to be able to say, all right, I don't want to look at this by zip code, I want to look at it by address, for example. Okay. All right, now I've mapped out all of my zip codes. You can see those here on my map. Unfortunately, I don't have any metrics tied to it, so it's just a bunch of data points on the screen here. Not very helpful. What I'd like to be able to do is map out customer complaints to each of these geographical data points. So I'll select something like, I don't really have a metric in here, but I do have a complaint ID. And what I'd like to do is I don't really want to sum complaint ID. I want to take a count of the complaint IDs that I have, because I don't really have a true metric in here. But I do want to really take account of each of the complaint IDs that I have. So all I did was I checked off the complaint ID. It automatically added it into the height property that you see right here. And then I can change the height property to, rather than summing the complaint ID, which is very much incorrect, I don't want to sum the complaint IDs. I want to instead take account of the complaint IDs. And really I can just do a count of the non-blanks. Okay? I don't need a count distinct here. Now, the reason I didn't want to sum the complaint IDs, you'll notice, is if I take you back to the table for just a moment, I don't want to summarize the complaint IDs because these complaint IDs are really just a auto-generated number here. They're nothing that I would want to aggregate up. Okay, so this kind of makes sense why I would not want to summarize those. Just want to point that out to you. All right, let's go back to our map. So I've now mapped out the count of all my complaint IDs. You can see you get this little legend here that appears, which is kind of obtrusive here, so I'm going to actually hit the little X on this to remove that label, or that legend. And I can always bring the legend back just by hitting the little legend button here in the top ribbon. So if I hit legend, I can bring it back. If it's taking too much space up, I can hit X and remove it. Okay. Now what we see with our map, though, is I can actually zoom in on certain areas. I can see there's some certain spikes in different areas of the country. I can look around and really interact with it, zoom in really deep into different areas of the map, which is pretty neat. But what I'd also like to do before we start getting really detailed into the data is I'd like to be able to see the complaints by, let's say, company, for example. So I have all kinds of different companies that have had complaints for them. So I'm going to bring in the field here called company. And what that's going to do is it's going to leave me with bar charts here. But these bar charts will then be able to be sliced by the different companies. So for example, as you look at this one here in South Florida, I can see this is probably my biggest complaint area that I have. And in this biggest complaint area, I can actually see which companies are getting the most complaints. So JP Morgan Chase had 36 complaints. Looks like Citibank had 15 complaints. Capital One had 18 complaints. So I can actually hover on top of the bar here to be able to visualize and see the number of complaints. Now this is one way that you can visualize this data. You can visualize it through a bar chart. And that's kind of the default behavior, is you can make it into a bar chart. You could also instead change this to something like a clustered bar chart, and it'll visualize it like you would a typical bar chart. So notice here, this is all still pointing to the same area, but it's placed those different bars across a more traditional looking bar chart. Now the way that I change that is inside this field list, you can see there's different ways you can visualize the data. If you're using the Excel preview will actually have a drop-down box here called Type, where you can change the visualizations inside the preview as well. If you don't have Office 365, then you can always use the preview to be able to visualize this data as well. Now, I mentioned you can do a bar chart like we saw here, kind of a stacked bar chart. You can do a clustered bar chart that we see here. I could also visualize this as more of a bubble. And the size of the bubble would be represented by the number of complaints, and then the different slices, more turned into a pie chart here. The different slices of the pie chart would then represent the different companies that have had complaints against them. I can also do something like a heat map. So I can change this to a heat map and see where the most red area shows and focuses in on the most complaints that I've had. Okay, and I can zoom this out at a whole view of the entire country and see where my most complaints are occurring. Let's do a heat map. And then you could also do something called regions. This is fairly new. This is actually available in the preview as well, but there's a region visualization where I can select region, And this may take a little while, but it's going to actually interpret all the rows that I have for my zip codes and visualize my zip codes as a region. Now think of regions as like a geopolitical boundary, or it's going to, and it's actually working on mapping this right now. It's going to map out all the zip codes that I have and really the borders for those zip codes, and based on the borders for those zip codes, it'll be able to visualize in a shade of which one of the zip codes had the most complaints. So check this out. As we zoom in here, you'll start to see a bunch of the zip codes are starting to populate. Now, keep in mind this data set is showing only zip codes that have complaints. So if we had zip codes where there were not complaints, then we would not see a region here for them. But I can zoom in and see the different areas and see all these zip codes that have now been highlighted based on my regions. Now, the regions allow you to do some categorization, so I can actually bring in here, if I want to bring back in the company, I can bring company back in, and it'll actually show each of the regions that have customer complaints against them in different colors. So each of the regions are going to have a different color based on the company that had the most complaints against them. So really kind of neat stuff that you can do here. Now, let me zoom out again. I'm going to flip this back over to a bar chart like we had originally and be able to view this at a high level here. Now this is interesting. We're able to see all the complaints across the entire country. I find that pretty interesting, but I want to take this a step further. I have multiple data sets that are part of this workbook. Right now we're looking at customer complaints for credit cards, but I want to be able to add in demographics data, or maybe just population even. I want to be able to see where the most populated areas are the country and see if there's any correlation between population and number of complaints. You would certainly think there would be. You'd think where there's the most population, the most complaints would also exist. So I'm going to bring in a new layer to this map. You see this first layer to my map is called Layer 1, which, by the way, you can rename. So I can rename this if I want. I can call this my credit card data. Okay, and I'm going to add in a new map layer by going over to the layer manager here in the top right, but the left icon. So I'm going to go to the layer manager and add in a new layer. Just by simply hitting the add button here, it adds in a new layer for me. So now I can analyze two different data sets on top of each other in a single map. So my Fruity Pebbles map here that we see right now will kind of be changed in a moment to show multiple layers. All right, so I'm going to go flip back over to my new layer that I've just created. I'm going to rename this one demographic data, or let's just call it population. All right, so with this population layer that I have, I'm going to bring in the geography ID. And geography ID, by the way, is a correlation to zip code as well. Okay. Now you'll notice some funny stuff is kind of happening with my map. And what this is basically doing is it's plotting out each of the zip codes that occur by population. Now this visualization right now is showing a bar chart for every one of my zip codes that exist in the country. Not a very great visualization for this. Probably a better way to visualize this would be something like a heat map. I want to see where all of my population is, and I want to do that through a heat map. Now I can select a heat map like I've done here, and I can bring in something like the population. So you'll see I have a column in here for the population. And I've now brought in the population so I can see where my most populated areas of the country are. I can remove this little legend if I want to, because you may guess that the more red it is, the more population there is. So I'm going to hit red on that. And I can zoom in on certain areas of the country if I wanted to again. You'll notice that the heat map kind of adjusts as I zoom in to certain areas. And it might be a little difficult to view right now because we have these two layers on top of each other. So one thing I can do is I can remove layers at a time if I wanted to. So I can kill one of these layers. I'm just going to remove the credit card layer for the moment. And I can see really this is just the total population of the United States by zip code. I can zoom in, see certain areas of the map that are more populated. Northeast, obviously very populated. West Coast has a high population, of course. And then the Midwest, the whole middle part of the country is not as populated, except for some certain pockets where there's some larger cities. So interesting that you can see, but really I want to look at all this data at the same time. So I'm going to bring back in the other data set we had a moment ago. It's really easy to add back in. Okay. And I want to be able to see, again, the number of complaints. Okay. So same thing we did a moment ago. It's very easy to get back to where I was. And I want to see the number of complaints by company. That's what we were looking at just a moment ago, so I'll add that back in. All right, there we go. Now, this is great. We can see I have this map now where I've brought these two data sets together. It's kind of difficult to read like this, though. If we look at it like this, it's really difficult to see what's going on. So what I'd really like to do is add in a time element to this so I can see across time how things have changed, the more complaints that I've gotten across time, for example. So I'm going to add in the dates that these complaints were received. So I'm adding in the date that a complaint was received, and you'll notice as soon as I add in that date field that it gives me this new bar here in the bottom portion of Power Map. And basically what this bar does is it allows you to visualize data across time. All right, so now that I've added in that date field, I can actually hit this little animate button here, or this play button, and it'll show me my complaints across time. And you can see the time element showing here in the top left, and the actual data points for my credit card complaints increasing across time. Now I only have a time element for my credit card complaints. I don't have a time element for my population, although I'm sure I could kind of dig that out if I wanted to. But here I'm able to see each of the credit card complaints shown across time, and all I have to do is kind of animate this chart to be able to visualize that. Now we're looking at this from an entire view of the country, which is kind of difficult to view here. So what I'd rather do instead is, instead of focusing in on the entire country, I'm actually going to create multiple scenes that focus in on different areas of the country, so I can see what was going on at different points in time in different areas of the country. So I'm going to create, I'm actually going to come up from the top left here, the top left part of my screen. I'll name this tour. I'll call this credit card complaints. Okay. And I'll call this scene, this is our first scene that we've been working on, I'll call this first scene US. So it's just an entire view of the entire US portion here. Now I want to be able to create multiple scenes where I can hop across different parts of the country. So I'm going to come up to the top section here and select Add Scene. So I'll hit Add Scene, and I get a new scene available to me here now. I'll name this scene as well. I'll call this let's call this my South Florida scene, because we saw a lot of complaints in South Florida. So I'll name this scene South Florida, and then I could actually come down here in the bottom and zoom in into that South Florida area. Now, if you actually go look at what zip code this is, where I have this really tall bar, this is actually Boca Raton. So I can see if I wanted to bring in some demographic data, see if maybe it has something to do with the age frame or the age range of the people that are living in Boca Raton. Maybe many of you already know the age range that lives in Boca Raton. It's usually older population. But I can actually see and kind of make some kind of correlation. Do people that are in a certain age range make more complaints? The typical stereotype for Florida, a lot of retirees like to move to South Florida, and that's definitely the case for Boca Raton. So you could probably make some estimation on why there's so many complaints in that area. Maybe you're trying to correlate it in some way. All right, so I've created a new scene here called South Florida. I'm going to name it properly, and I'll leave it just like that. I'm going to create a new scene, though. I'm going to create multiple scenes. So I'm going to come up to the top here and say Add Scene again. You can see we actually have 3 scenes created now. And in this third scene, what I'd like to do is focus in on a different area of the map. And the way I'm going to do it this time is by using a nice little functionality here inside Power Map where it allows you to find a location. You'll see there's a little Find Location option up here in the top. And if you click on that Find Location, it'll allow you to drill to or really focus in on a certain area of the map without you having to zoom in and zoom out all on your own. So for example, if I hit Find Location here and tell it that I want to focus in on Atlanta, for example, it'll zoom me over to Atlanta and show me a view of Atlanta. And it just hopped me over there pretty quickly. I can zoom in and zoom out still if I'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and call this my Atlanta scene. And we'll create another one. I'm going to focus in on several different areas of the country here. The next one I'll do is Los Angeles. So let's do Los Angeles. Okay, so I'll create another Los Angeles scene here just to show what's going on in different areas of the country. Whenever I produce this and send this to my users, I want them to be able to see multiple areas of the country and see how they compare to each other. This time I'll call this new scene, I'll create another one here. I'll call this one Detroit. So let's see what's going on in Detroit. So I will do Find Location, go to Detroit, and see the credit card complaints that exist in Detroit. All right, so I have a total here of, let me go ahead and name this one. Looks like I forgot to name this one. I have a total of, it looks like about 5 different scenes I've created. I can obviously create more if I wanted, but I'm going to leave this at 5. That's enough for a quick demonstration here. Now, you can hop back and forth between the different scenes. If I go on the left-hand side here, I can hop back and forth between them. I'm sure this is really refreshing to see in a GoToMeeting environment where it lags a few seconds. But what I want to show you here is now how I can animate this across time. If I hit this little play tour button up in the top left, it'll take each of the scenes that I've created and bring them together and produce basically like a little movie out of it. So if I hit this play tour button, it shows me the number of credit card complaints at my first scene, and then after my first scene completes, it'll move down to my second scene, which was in Atlanta. I must have removed my South Florida one or moved it somewhere. Once it shows me all the Atlanta complaints, it'll then move on to my next scene, which should pop up here. Oh, it actually showed Atlanta twice there, so I made some mistake there in my design I can fix. But once it gets done showing me Atlanta, it'll move over to Los Angeles, show me all the complaints in Los Angeles. By the way, when you're creating these tours, you can put little annotations here. So if I wanted to put an annotation like give my user a note that tells them information about what they're seeing, I can do that, and I'll show you that here in a moment. You can even add inside those annotations, you can add in images. So let me show you what I mean by this. Let me exit out of this for a moment. All right, looks like my South Florida scene did get kind of reset here, so let me go back to Boca Raton. Okay. All right, so check this out. Here's what I'd like to do. I know I have a lot of complaints in South Florida, but what I'd like to do is make it whenever I create this tour that I highlight which one of the companies has the most complaints. So for example here, it looks like JP Morgan Chase has the most complaints. So I could actually take an annotation here just by simply right-clicking on the design surface, and I can tell it that I want to add an annotation, and you actually have to select a data point when you do this. So I would right-click here, tell it I want to add an annotation, and then I can give this annotation a title, call it something like major complaints. And then I can actually provide a custom field, or I can use an image, or I can even, let's actually call this JP Morgan complaints. Okay, oops, spelling matters. And then I could either bring in fields for my data set to add in here. So I can bring in the company name, for example, so I can actually tell it JP Morgan Chase. Or I can bring in an image. So I can go find an image that I have stored on my machine and provide that image into the interface. So whenever the tour is animated, it'll show a picture of the JP Morgan Chase logo. So I can certainly do that. I can go find one, save it locally. It does have to be saved locally, unfortunately. And then bring that into my Power Map solution. So really kind of neat things that you can do here. All right, so I'm going to bring in the company name, and I'll leave it at that. So that adds a little annotation. It looks just like this, and then whenever my scene animates, or my tour animates, it will show that little annotation to my users where I can kind of identify where the most complaints are being generated. All right. All right, cool. So a couple more things I want to show you here with Power Map. At the very top portion of my screen, the ribbon area, you'll notice that you can actually change to different themes. So you'll see here that I have a different theme selection. I can pick from different themes that I want to visualize the map in. Some of these are okay. Some of these are pretty terrible. But you can select the different high contrast. This looks more like a weather map kind of thing. Or you can select something more like a map like this where you can kind of change different visualizations. You'll notice here, though, in my scene selection, that you can change a lot of these properties and make that property only visible on a particular scene. So I can change a property on one scene and not have it apply to another scene. So there is some flexibility there with how you actually visualize that. But just know that you have the ability here to change the different types of themes that you visualize as. Probably the default one is the best one unless you have a really good use case for the others. So I want to make sure I pointed that out to you. You also have the ability, and really this is how you're going to output your tours to your users, is you have the ability here to create a video. Okay, so I can take what I've created in these different scenes and this finally into this larger tour, create a video out of it just by hitting create video, and then I can actually tell it that I want to output this into a video, and it could even be a high resolution video here. It can be a 1080p, 720p, 360p. Now one of the new features that they've added into Power Map is the ability to add in a soundtrack. This was not available until the latest release. The Office 365 release of Power Map allows you to put a soundtrack to your mapping solution. Now you could certainly have done this before in the past, but you would have had to bring the video into some kind of video editor and then have applied a audio on top of it. But now I can do it directly from inside of Excel if I have a soundtrack I want to add to it, or maybe perhaps it's me talking about the video or talking about the data. I could do that as well. So I could record myself discussing what they're seeing in the data and then apply that soundtrack into the output of the video. It's pretty simple to do. You just select soundtrack options, tell it where the soundtrack is. It even tells you how long your video would be and whether you want it to loop over and over. So if I have music, for example, I may want it to loop over and over until the end of the video. You can certainly do that here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it that I want to create a video. I'll make it a 360p, and hit create, and you'll actually see it'll ask me where do I want to save this video. So I may want to save it somewhere on my desktop, for example. And I've already done this once because I wanted to show it to you without you having to wait for me to render this video. So I'll hit save, and you'll see it start to create the video. Now, rather than making you guys wait for that video to get created, it does take a few moments. I'm going to show you one that's already been created here. Okay. I have it under my special little delete later folder here, and here we go. This is actually, I'm going to bring over on my screen, this is a completed video that I created earlier that I'll actually run through and show you each of the different visualizations here. There we go, there it pops in. So the final output is actually a video, and you can be able to use that video and show it to your users. So you really, the size limits once it's in the video form. I could put this on YouTube, I could actually put this embedded in my SharePoint site. You can embed videos in your SharePoint site, and that might be a great way to be able to share it with others. Okay. All right. So this is going to take a few moments to create the video. Of course, the time to create the video is dependent on what resolution you select. It's also dependent on the how long the video is, of course. Now, depending on the resolution you select, it'll also maybe increase the file size, as you may guess. The higher resolution, the larger the file size is. Now, the one other piece I wanted to show you, we showed you regions a few moments ago. The one last thing I'm going to show you guys before we wrap it up is the ability to change the color specifically on your different bars or your different regions that you have created. So I'm going to open up another completed example here just so I can show you, and I actually showed this in a previous webinar. This is election data that I'm going to show you, and we're almost out of time here, so I'm going to be brief here. But what I want to show you inside this solution is how you can actually adjust the coloring that's used on your map. So for example, let me show you this blank design surface here. I'm bringing in different states that I have. So let me actually change this to states right here. There we go. And I'm going to remove this one here. All right. So I'm going to map out each of my states, and this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to use regions. So regions is just a geographical, geopolitical boundary for your mapping functionality here. And what I'd like to be able to do is show each of the political party votes that I've had. So the political party, or really the votes by a political party. Now I've shown this in a previous webinar, so I'm not going to get deep into this one. So if you're really interested in this particular sample, I spent a lot of time showing this in a past webinar. Now, but what I want to show you in here that's important is how you actually have the flexibility with these different regions to change the color, which is really pretty important when you're looking at things like political parties. For example, you can see here that the California is lit up in red, and California would never be lit up in red, in modern day times anyways. It's always kind of slanted Democrat. And for some reason, Texas is usually Republican, but it's showing here as green, which I don't really know what green represents, but it's definitely not the Republican Party. So what I can do here is Power Map has just kind of randomly selected colors for these different categories. But what I could optionally do here is change, for example, the shading. So if I didn't want it to shade at all, I can turn off the shading and just make it, the straight up colors here. So now it kind of looks like the Christmas colors. But I could now take these colors and make it so that they're very specific. So I may want to, for example, have the Democratic Party to light up in blue. Okay, kind of like this. I could pick a darker blue. It's really up to you. And I want to have the Republican Party, so I'll go find the Republican Party here. I want the Republican Party to show up in their traditional colors as red. And that gives you the flexibility to really change, especially if you have regions, maybe sales regions that you like to have certain colors. You can certainly do add in that functionality here. Now, one question that I get quite often is, can you put in your own custom regions? So maybe you have your own sales regions, for example, that cover multiple states. Now, there isn't the ability to put in your own custom regions, but if your regions cover particular states, you could certainly do that. And really, here's what I mean by that. If I have a table, for example, that has each of my sales members or my sales staff and what their region is. So maybe they're the Northeast region. And I also have a column in there for state that shows each of the states that are within that region. Then I would map it based off the state and then bring in the region name as a category, and that would allow me to visualize that in a different color coding methodology. Now I can't have a region that covers part of a state unless it's to a very specific geopolitical boundary like a zip code or a county or something like that. So just keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that geopolitical boundaries are perhaps very rigid inside the United States, but in other parts of the country, say for example the Middle East, they are very flexible. They change. It really depends on who you're asking and what time period it is. So you may not particularly get what you're expecting with these different regions based on what part of the country you're looking at. Of course, the United States is very rigid, and we don't have geopolitical boundaries change very frequently in the United States, but other parts of the country they certainly do. So keep that in mind as well. The one last piece that I didn't have a moment to show you, which I will show you here now, is how you can adjust the time element. So we talked about time being added in here, and how you can actually animate this across time. We saw that kind of extensively at this point. But you do have also the flexibility to change how fast that time moves and the ability to filter down that time. That's done by hitting the little time setup options here. You'll see there's a little cog. Anytime you see this little settings button or cog, that usually means it's a setting for a property. So I'm going to hit on the setting button for time, and what that will allow me to do is really adjust. You can see it brought me over to the scene options here. It'll give me the ability to adjust several things here. I can change, for example, the scene duration, so how long that scene runs. I can adjust the transition duration. So transition would be from scene to scene. So when I went from the southeast to Atlanta, I could tell it that I want that transition to take 3 or 5 or maybe 2 seconds. I can really adjust that. You also can adjust the little effect that happens during the transition. So there's things like you can make it do a figure 8, you can make it do a flyover. There's some different transition options that you have available to you there as well. And then finally, the last time element that you can adjust here is the actual time that's visualized on the map. So I can filter down to show just a certain date range. Maybe perhaps I only want to show data that was in 2012. Then I would come in here and I would adjust the time frame as well. You can also adjust the speed at which it goes through that time. So there are a lot of little properties that you can kind of tinker with and be able to adjust to get the map just how you want into a final solution of that video we saw a few moments ago. So some really, really neat things here in PowerMap. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. That's really all I have to show you today. I actually went pretty deep into PowerMap. I'll bring my last slide up here, and this is usually just to kind of, if you have any kind of follow-up questions or if you like to follow me on Twitter. I do tweet a lot about Power BI. You're welcome to follow me there. You're welcome to email me with questions. I also blog at my website, devonitesql.com. But I'll spend the last few minutes, the last 7 minutes or so that we have, five or so minutes, on any questions we have. So Rachel, if you could just kind of see what questions we have, I'll really wrap up.
Sure. We do have a couple questions. So here is the first one. Am I correct in that you need to have the Pro Plus version of Office 365 and not the Home or University version to run these?
Yeah, that's correct. So any of the Power Map functionality is going to require the professional edition. So if it's Power Map, or even if you're trying to do some of the other, like Power Pivot, even Power Pivot requires that you have Professional Plus, whether it's Office 365 or traditional Excel. It all does require Professional Pro Plus, and even Power Query. So all the Power tools really require you have, like you said, the Pro Plus version of Excel.
Okay, great. What do you need for custom maps? Latitude and longitude? Example, if you're looking for political data by precinct.
Yeah, so if you're trying to create your own custom map, you can certainly do it. You just need to have a, so there's really two answers to this. You can't do your own regions yet. Let me emphasize yet. So if I wanted to be able to make my own kind of sales region, it would have to fit into more of a traditional geopolitical boundary. So I could provide it a state name or a zip code or a county or something like that. What I can't do is cross multiple counties unless I somehow set it up in my table so that a particular county or multiple counties is categorized within a certain region. So Pro, I can kind of set up my table to be able to go across multiple counties and show my own regions that I have in my business. The con is I can't put in my own basically visualizations of how the outline should show. So if I don't like how Florida is showing up or how New York is showing up inside my Power Map solution, I can't adjust. I can't bring in my own what am I trying to think of the name of the thing where it's you actually show the outline of the state, and there's a specific name for it. You can't show that in Power Map yet. I don't know if that functionality is coming out yet. There hasn't been any announcements on that yet, but I'll emphasize yet because Power Map is still a very new tool, so I would imagine some of that functionality will come soon, but it's just not there quite yet.
Okay, great. Here's a good question. Is there a cost to using Bing Maps?
No, so it's all free. There's no service charge you have to use for it. It's as long as you have an internet connection, you are good to go. No additional cost to use it other than the traditional Excel cost. So whether you're using Office 365 or the traditional version of Excel, just your regular Excel cost, nothing in addition to that.
Okay, great. Is there an online place that you're aware of to download countries, latitude, and longitudes, or counties even, to show instead of the globe?
Gotcha. So I'm sure there is. I don't know a place off the top of my head. I have to do some searching. But yeah, I'm sure there is some places that are available on the web. Now the really cool thing about your suggestion here is it ties together all the Power BI tools. So if you've been hanging in with us here for the last week or this week of Power BI tools, they really do all work together and they integrate together. And I'm going to take your question and kind of transition into that discussion for just a few moments. Is with your example, if I found some data on the web that I wanted to use to be able to integrate into Power Map, if it's some data I wanted to visualize, I could use the tool called Power Query. I could use Power Query to pull that data in, which by the way we'll have a session on tomorrow. We'll have a Power Query session tomorrow. It shows you how to pull data in from all kinds of unusual data sources, including the web. But I can pull data in with Power Query, use Power Pivot to join it together and relate it to existing data sets. I could visualize the data one of two ways, either through Power Map or through Power View, those two different types of visualizations. You guys saw Power View yesterday. And I can visualize it in one of those two different ways. And then finally, I can deploy it to a Power BI site. And then from that Power BI site, I can use things like Power BI Q&A, which we saw on Tuesday, to be able to ask questions of my data. So it really does all kind of tie together and really kind of wraps itself together with a final point where I can bring this into a mobile BI app. So it really does all fit together, and that's kind of the beauty of Power BI.
Okay, great. We have a couple more questions. I don't think we're going to have time to get through all of them, so I just want to make you guys aware we will send this report to Devin, and he can get all these questions, and he will definitely follow up via a blog post because he's awesome at blogging. Here is the next question. Is there any way to use custom geographic data to use to shape the file? For example, school district boundaries.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar question to what we had earlier. So you can't do that, unfortunately. The one thing you can do is you can do it by zip code. But it won't let you kind of make your own shapes yet. You can certainly do some of that in SQL Server. So SQL Server will allow you to do that through other kind of visualization tools like reporting services. But as far as Power Map, it does not have that ability to bring in your own custom shapes. And that's kind of the wording I was looking for earlier that I was struggling over. But yeah, you can't bring in your own custom shapes yet. Emphasis on yet.
Okay. Does the date need to be in a rigid date format for the time slide to work?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so when you're using the time element that we looked at a few moments ago, if you want to be able to use a time element, it does have to be at a date granularity. So if you have year data, then you'll need to reformat that data to at least appear as a year. So for example, if you have a column in there called year and it has 2002, 2003, 2004, so on and so forth, then you're probably going to want to prefix it and change the data type has to be a date. So you may want to prefix it through Power Pivot and do a little bit of DAX to prefix it with a 1/1, 2002, 1/1, 2003, because Power Map won't be able to pull that data in unless it's actually as a date first. So you have to adjust the data type as a date before you can visualize it there in Power Map.